Where do religion and political power come together?
Virtually every religious tradition has had to come to terms with its relationship to civil authority and power. As often as not, the relationship varies at least slightly from one political setting to another. Even in the United States, many traditions have shifted their positions historically. The standard and seemingly straightforward principle of separation of church and state has been reinterpreted in various ways, with prominent religious figures seeking and winning national elected office as high as the United States Senate. The situation has historically been still more complex where political rulers have declared one religious tradition the state creed. That has often meant hard times for members of faith communities that have not enjoyed official patronage and protection. Popular perception nowadays tends to label Islam as the tradition most likely to take political shape, as if no other has ever done so. But ample data from the history of religion suggests that questions of the relationship of temporal to spiritual power have arisen for virtually every major tradition at some time or other.
Are there religious hierarchical structures in any branch of Buddhism?
Early Buddhist teaching replaced the caste system's dramatic social and religious stratification with an egalitarian ideal. Be a lamp unto your own feet, the Buddha counseled his followers. His rejection of a mediating priesthood made the Buddha a sort of Protestant reformer. He wanted the life of the Sangha to represent a perfectly level playing field. In practice, the elevation of the monastic life over that of the laity introduced a kind of stratification into Buddhist life. Within the early monastic community, seniority alone distinguished one member from another. As the Sangha expanded and the itinerant mendicants began to settle into fixed residences, monastic life became more complex and required a division of labor. Though many decisions were taken by a monastic council, a de facto hierarchy developed. At the top was the abbot, assisted by spiritual guides and preceptors chosen from among the senior monks. The majority of the community was made up of senior monks and nuns and novices. In addition, many of the denominations eventually took on a semblance of hierarchical organization. But there is a major difference between the function of such organizational structures in Buddhist institutions and parallels in traditions like Roman Catholicism and Shiite Islam. Buddhist hierarchies seem to evolve as a result of internal structural needs rather than as a result of doctrine. Traditions that teach the need for mediators between ordinary people and the ultimate sources of truth and spiritual power develop hierarchical structures for theoretical as well as practical reasons.
How many different kinds of scriptural writings are there?
Sacred literature has taken virtually every form imaginable. The most ancient texts in many traditions are poetic, hymns of praise, songs of thanksgiving for victory, or prayers of petition for a favorable harvest. Early poetic texts are typically associated with liturgical rituals. Related to these are modified types of poetry adapted to specialized purposes such as prophecies or soothsaying or incantations meant to give power to the one who utters them. Wisdom sayings in the form of easy-to-remember proverbs are part of nearly every tradition. Narrative accounts in prose play several essential roles. One is to recount the deeds of the spiritual powers that brought the community into being. The gods, these are typically called myth. Another is to preserve the history of the community or the biography of a foundational figure. Narratives also illustrate the central tenets of the tradition by way of vivid example. As in just as our ancestor in faith did when. Prophetic texts can be either poetry or prose. But either way, their main purpose is not generally to foretell the future, as is commonly assumed. Prophets speak on behalf of an ultimate spiritual power and their focus is typically on the need for change here and now. Another important type of religious text is called apocalyptic, from a Greek term meaning revelatory. Apocalyptic literature often uses highly figurative language, describing in detail events that the author has seen in visions or dreams and that will soon come to pass. Such dramatic texts are often taken as direct predictions of how the end of time will come about. Finally, many scriptures include rules or laws in the form of commands and prohibitions. But only a few sacred texts are entirely legal.
Where does academic regalia come from?
Early every student who graduates from high school or college makes a passing connection with Confucian tradition. Academic robes with their wide flowing sleeves are at least vaguely similar to those worn by Confucian ritual leaders even today in places like Taiwan and Korea when they celebrate the master's birthday or honor royal ancestors. But one look at the headgear and the viewer knows instantly where the so-called mortar board came from. Principal participants in important Confucian rituals sport large flat rectangular boards worn with flat sides, rather than corners, as in common graduation practice now, facing the wearer's front, back, and sides. Confucian mortar boards outdid modern ones in ornamentation, with rows of tassels all along the front and back edges.
Do Buddhist communities run private religious schools?
In some parts of the world, traditional Buddhist religious education remains important. In Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka, for example, devout Buddhists still send their children for instruction in the local monastery. Nearly half of Thailand's primary schools are those of the local wats or temples. and some monks travel to other schools to teach. Adults may also attend classes, lectures, and educational sermons. Monks naturally get their core religious training within the monastery's own educational structure. But skill in means requires that an effective person know how to put that learning into action. Some Thai universities have developed special curricula designed to aid the monks in their wider ministry. They can take courses in a range of socially oriented subjects and skills, including public health and hygiene, food preparation, construction of roads and bridges, temple and village organizing, agricultural development, and conflict resolution.
What are the 10 Commandments?
Also known as the Decalogue, the so-called Ten Commandments are based on Exodus 20:1-17, in which God speaks to Moses at Mount Sinai and reveals his 10 words on inscribed tablets. There is no single, definitive text of the 10 Commandments. Rather, various denominations of Jews and Christians alike have boiled down a relatively lengthy message into their own renderings of 10 brief and direct statements. For the most part, they embody the following 10 directives: you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make unto yourself any graven image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor.
Do Muslims engage in any specific purification rituals?
Prior to each act of ritual prayer, Muslims perform a brief purification called wudu, pronounced wudu. Worshippers perform each of the following cleansing motions 3 times, rinse hands and wrists. Rinse out the mouth, then the nostrils likewise, rinse the whole face. Arms up to the elbows, whole head and neck, and finally toes and feet up to the ankles. Mosques today typically provide separate facilities in which men and women can perform the ablution. Older mosques often have fountains or taps running along an exterior wall, with small benches or stools for worshippers to sit on. They usually use tap water, but under peculiar circumstances even sand or earth is acceptable, in which case it is called tayammum, pronounced tawayyum. Clearly the idea is to prepare oneself symbolically to enter a special state of mindfulness. In addition to this cleansing, Muslims also regard a more thorough bathing, called ghusl, essential to restore the state of ritual purity after sexual intercourse, seminal discharge, or the menstrual cycle. Ghusl includes the motions of the ablution just described, but encompasses the entire body as well. The intent of these rituals is to put the individual in a state of maximum attentiveness to and spiritual worthiness for entering into the presence of God.
What happens when a non-Jew wishes to convert to Judaism?
Prospective converts who present themselves with appropriate motivation for the change undergo a period of special instruction in the faith and its main practices. They meet regularly with a rabbi or learned layperson to discuss key texts of scripture and major features of tradition. The precise details of instruction may vary somewhat from one branch of Judaism to another. But in general the emphasis is on the religious obligations the convert is about to accept. Candidates then have a brief examination before the modern-day equivalent of the ancient House of Judgment. Bet Din, usually 3 people active in the faith, including but not limited to rabbis. A ceremonial purifying bath in a pool called a mikveh comes next. Men must be circumcised, and those already circumcised go through a ceremony called circumcision for drawing blood to remove only a token drop of blood. Finally, the convert is welcomed into the community of believers.
Are dance and drama equally important?
Bugaku, refined dance in 160 different styles, is often performed to the accompaniment of a gagaku ensemble and sometimes occurs in Buddhist temples as well as Shinto shrines. It is somewhat more formal and classical than Kagura, a uniquely Shinto form of liturgical dance with musical accompaniment. The name apparently derives from a term that means temporary abode of the kami, a place on earth to which worshippers summon the deities. Kagura has its mythic roots in the dance of the terrible female of heaven that lured the sun goddess to emerge from her cave. Unlike the more staid classical version danced for the emperor on December's full moon night. Shrine, or village, Kagura now reenacts often raucous scenes from mythological narratives. Several of the great shrines, such as those of Izumo, Kashiga, and Ise, are especially known for their long-standing traditions of Kagura performance. Some shrines have special structures dedicated to Kagura, but many still stage the dance in the large open space in front of the worship hall. Bon Odori is a popular form of folk dancing performed at festivals on shrine grounds. Celebrants dance around a large, raised scaffold-like platform on which drummers and other musicians perch to play their popular Hayashi-style music. Perhaps the best known of Shinto-related dances is the dragon dance, often associated with festival parades. In shrine dances, the dragon begins by bowing to the kami and the chief priest before writhing its way across the sacred precincts. The ancient Japanese theater form called No also has roots in the reenactment of Shinto myths.
What does the term Hinduism mean?
as a standard term in religious studies. Hinduism refers to a whole family of religious traditions deeply rooted in the Indian subcontinent. Hinduism derives from an ancient linguistic root that means to flow. And rivers have indeed been and have remained a central feature in the religious life of nearly a billion Indians. A bit of river imagery here will help to explain how many diverse traditions have come together to form the greater Hinduism of our day. Imagine an extensive network of rivers stretching across the whole of the Indian subcontinent. One major river flows from the northwest down toward the Indian heartland. Another originates in the south. Each grows as dozens of tributaries flow into it along its course. In the center of the subcontinent, the two broad streams come together into one vast waterway. As it nears the sea, the great river opens again into a broad delta. The northern river, called the Aryan, carries a system of religious beliefs that came together from tributaries to the northwest of India as long as 5 or 6 millennia ago. Deities of the Aryan tradition seem to have much in common with those of the classical Greek and Roman pantheons, with their lords of wind, weather, and sky. The Dravidian river to the south represents ancient indigenous traditions surrounding the forces that rule earth and fertility, mountain and valley, powers of life and death. Beyond the confluence of the two great river systems, no one remembers that the one immense flood was once many.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Shinto worship and prayer?
Shinto tradition refers to all of its ritual furniture and utensils with the term saikigo. It includes several items used on every altar during offering ceremonies. The priest carries the offerings, hihaku, and gifts of food, shinzen, on a tray, sambo, which he sets upon an 8-legged table, hasekuin, made of a special reddish cypress wood, hinoki, fire tree. Priestly staff remove these objects after worship ends. Objects used regularly in nearly all rituals include several items that ritual specialists wave over those to whom they are ministering. Branches of the sakeke, combining characters for tree and kami, provide a splash of greenery and association with living nature. A wand used for purification, either in place of or in conjunction with the sakeke branch, is called harigushi, a thick cluster of white paper streamers attached to a long stick. Another stick with a set of zigzag cut white, and sometimes of other colors. Paper symbolizes the kami's presence in the holy place. All three objects are mounted on stands and displayed when not in use by one of the priests or a miko. Miko also use a set of 5 bells, suzu, for their sacred dances. Several larger implements play a central role in the great public festivals called matsuri. Most important is the portable shrine called the mikoshi. Celebrants carry this miniature, but still often very heavy, 4-sided model of a shrine sanctuary in procession, shouldering long beams that hold the shrine aloft. Larger mikoshi can weigh up to several tons and require a large crew of strong bearers. In some places large wagons called yatai and dashi rumble through the streets on massive wheels, carrying groups of musicians and revelers. Built like mobile shrines. The hefty wooden wagons range in height from just over 30 feet to about 65 feet.
What about Baha'is and the group called the Ahmadiyya?
In mid-19th century Persia, a faction called the Babis, followers of the Bab, gateway, broke away from Twelver Shi'ism. The Bab had prophesied the coming of a promised Messiah-like figure. A role claimed by a man who called himself Baha'u'llah and claimed the office of prophet. Upon his death in 1892, a follower took up the claim, as did others. According to mainstream Muslim belief, there can be no prophet after Muhammad. So Baha'is are considered non-Muslims. Around the time the Baha'i movement was getting started in Iran, a group formed around a Punjabi named Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, 1835 to 1908, who claimed to be both the Mahdi and Jesus' second coming. Around 1909 the Ahmadiyya, followers of Ahmad, split into two main factions. One claimed their founder was a prophet, thus meriting an official condemnation from Islamic authorities. The other Ahmadiyya faction insisted that Ahmad was only a religious reformer. From 500,000 to 1 million members live in West Africa and Pakistan. Most Muslims today consider Baha'is and Ahmadiyyas non-Muslims.
What is holy?
Originally a fertility festival, this late winter celebration of several days, ending with the full moon of Fulguna, is named after the demoness Holika. She was in the habit of eating a child each day until a holy widow summoned all the children to curse the demoness together. Amid great hubbub, participants today let out the kind of energy the children must have unleashed on Holika. They throw multicolored powders and liquids on each other, evidently a visual remnant of the children's curses. By a fascinating process of association, the celebration has also come to embrace the mythological downfall of evil female figures. For example, Krishna destroyed the demoness Putana, whom the evil king Kamsa had sent, disguised as a wet nurse, to kill the infant deity by poisoning him with her breast milk.
What are the 3 jewels and 5 vows?
Perhaps the closest thing to a summary of Buddhist beliefs is the brief creedal formula of the 3 jewels. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. Buddhists in various places and times have interpreted those jewels rather differently. For many the Buddha was a human teacher and an example, but no more. For many others, the Buddha represented the universal possibility of enlightenment. Still others regard the Buddha, along with countless Buddhas, to be called bodhisattvas, as a divine power and source of grace and salvation. Buddhist tradition retained the important Hindu term dharma but reinterpreted it. For Buddhists, dharma means all that the Buddha taught. They know dharma as enshrined in the sacred texts and communicated by religious teachers. The term Sangha means assembly and refers to the Buddhist order of monks and nuns and, by extension, to the whole community of believers. Along with the affirmation of the three jewels, a secondary but very important affirmation of the precepts or vows. Members of the monastic Sangha take 10 vows, while devout laypersons take the first 5. Many Buddhists begin their day by reciting the 3 refuges, and then adding the 5 precepts. They promise to refrain from killing, theft, unchastity, deception, and intoxication. Reaffirming one's commitment to the precepts functions not unlike a creedal statement of assent to the core beliefs of a religious tradition.
What do Daists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
Daists call the ultimate spiritual reality Deo, the way. Long before the formal beginnings of Daoism's various movements and school, Chinese tradition used the term Dao as a general ethical notion implying the appropriate and moral way of acting. As so often happens when a religious tradition enters a new cultural setting, Buddhism's arrival in China led some thinkers to talk of a Buddhist way in contrast with which they began to define an indigenous Chinese way in the sense of religious beliefs and values. Daoist philosophers emphasized the unfathomable mystery of the Dao, but they viewed it as non-personal power rather than a personal divine entity. The religious equivalent seems to have been a deity called the Supreme Oneness, Tai Yi. The Dao De Jing's description of how the transcendent Dao became manifest suggests a type of emanation. Dao gave rise to the One, which produced the Two, and so on. That grand and uplifting description of the ultimate mystery still remained a bit too abstract for most people. As a result, when the first schools of religious Daoism began to formulate their beliefs, they naturally gravitated toward more concrete imagery. That included the deification of the individual, long believed to represent the way as an accessible teaching, namely Lao Zi. The process also led to personification of certain essential features of the mysterious Dao in the form of the heavenly triad called the Three Pure Ones. Developments of this sort multiplied, and the deities took on life stories and personalities that invited devotional interaction. In practice, the many personifications of divinity are arrayed according to an administrative structure parallel to that of the imperial bureaucracy. Religiously speaking, of course, the reality is just the other way round. The imperial institutions imitated the heavenly order of things.
What is a Rashi?
The Japanese term Rashi means old, i.e. venerable, teacher. It is the title of the spiritual master in Zen monasteries. Monks admitted to the Zen life must submit themselves entirely to the direction of the Rashi. However harsh and unrelenting his discipline may seem. Regular activities in which Rashi and monks encounter each other include the master's instructions to the group and monks' individual sessions in the Rashi's room. A Rashi's instructions, Taisho, Koza, take place in a lecture hall. Accompanied by 2 assistant monks, the Rashi burns incense before the Buddha image. After the monks recite sacred texts, the Rashi assumes his teaching chair and teaches for about an hour. Using short narratives and parables and concluding with a specific case of the issue he has been discussing. The monks are left to ponder the matter in depth. During the week-long retreats, called Dai-Sesshin, the Great Collecting Thoughts, that occur monthly during the traditional rainy season seclusion, the Rashi gives instructions daily. Ordinarily, individual monks will have the opportunity for voluntary individual sessions with the Rashi at regular intervals during the course of daily order. But during the Dai-Sesshin they will each see him briefly 4 times daily to discuss their koan or their progress in meditation. These sessions, called sanzen, are not a simple chat. There is no small talk with the Rashi. In a few choice words, the monk signals to the teacher whether he is making genuine progress. If he talks nonsense, the Rashi will toss him out unceremoniously with an admonition to get serious. One of Zen's greatest teachers, Dogen, 1200-53, described the ideal Rashi as able to transmit the Dharma. Warm but able to be harsh when necessary, standing in the Buddha's place in educating. Humble enough to ask his monks forgiveness, uninterested in fame or prestige, and concerned above all with simplicity. When it seems appropriate, the monk and the Rashi might even share a hearty laugh.
What is the meaning of the season of Lent or the Great Fast?
For at least 3 centuries, early Christians observed a 2 or 3 day fast in preparation for Easter. Canons of the Council of Nicaea in 325 represent the first reference to the later observance of a 40-day fast, recalling symbolically similar practices by Moses and Jesus. Lent now begins for Western Christians on Ash Wednesday, while Eastern Christians typically begin the Great Fast 2 days earlier. Until the 7th century, the season began on a Sunday, but since Sunday was exempted from fasting, the beginning was advanced so as to include a full 40 days fast. Ashes applied to the head are a reminder of human sinfulness and mortality and recall. an earlier practice in which penitents appeared in public wearing sackcloth and ashes. For centuries Christians fasted for a significant portion of each day, Monday through Saturday, and generally abstained entirely from meat. Contemporary practice has generally limited a modified form of fasting and abstinence to the first day of Lent and Good Friday. For example, Catholic practice recommends taking smaller meals at breakfast and lunch, together equaling less than one takes at the main meal, with no food in between. That is a far cry from serious fasting, but still at least a reminder of the purpose of the season, namely a heightened awareness of the need for spiritual conversion and dependence on God.
If I visited a Shinto shrine, what would I see?
Walk down almost any street in almost any Japanese city or town, and not many blocks along you will notice a simple, unobtrusive torii gate at street side. Turning to your right to look through the gate, you will be surprised to see a small grove of trees in the midst of storefronts and houses. You know from the torii that a Shinto shrine is nearby, but no structure is immediately evident. You walk through the gate and perhaps up a small hill, and as the shrine comes into view amid the trees, you will pass through another torii gate. At the end of the path stands a neighborhood shrine, consisting perhaps of only a single wooden structure, standing several feet off the ground and too small for a person to enter, is the residence of one of the local kami. On the front porch of the shrine, or perhaps alongside the tiny steps that lead up to the porch, there are several small white ceramic foxes, messengers of the deity Inari. Also on the porch just outside the shrine door are small offerings of various kinds, including a little wooden box for donations. Uncounted thousands of these unassuming shrines are quiet testimony to the presence of the divine powers. Larger shrines are naturally fewer in numbers but still abundant, preserving often relatively extensive tracts of forested land in burgs like Tokyo and Kyoto. The great shrines are all the more remarkable. Even in the heart of bustling Tokyo, for example, the high shrine still sits atop a surprisingly high and densely wooded knoll. As you pass under one and another monumental torii along the pathway to the center of shrines like Tokyo's splendid Meiji-Jinggu, you will find yourself slowing down and marveling at the beauty of ancient trees. The sheer power of place here is almost overwhelming, enveloping you with a profound sense of the sacred. At the heart of the place are worshippers, perhaps in large numbers depending on the day, approaching the outer building of the sanctuary to pray and make their offerings. If your timing is right, you might witness formal ceremonies of blessing or priestly offering. Shinto shrines do not present the kind of public face that Japan's numerous Buddhist temples show. Shinto's miniature and not so miniature holy forests are vivid reminders of the need to acknowledge the sanctity of nature, especially when the hunger for expediency and immediate gratification compromises reflection.
What are some of the main sources of religious sign and symbol?
Virtually any visual design or gesture can be used in religious contexts. Religious traditions draw on a limitless supply of natural and invented materials. From nature come a huge host of candidates from the animal kingdoms. Birds seem especially apt symbols. Sometimes as images of the human spirit or soul. Sometimes reminders of the utter freedom and beauty of the deity. Fish are also particularly evocative, dwelling as they do in a medium ungenial to human beings and thus capable of suggesting the otherness of the holy. Powerful beasts of prey as well as animals known for their gentleness often stir the religious imagination. Trees, along with every imaginable kind of flower, find symbolic place in numerous traditions. Among inanimate natural things, heavenly luminaries and constellations have numerous resonances with qualities often associated with the divine. Sometimes related to astronomical symbols are the myriad geometric forms found across the whole spectrum of traditions, with the same form playing very different roles from one to another.
What is a kamikaze?
Divine storm blast roughly translates the term kamikaze that so many World War II films brought into relatively common English usage. Japanese began to use the term during the Middle Ages in reference to how the gods fended off the Mongol invaders led by Kublai Khan in 1280, a descendant of Genghis Khan. During World War II, the Japanese Air Force resorted to a desperate tactic when the tide began to turn against Japan. Pilots willing to commit suicide for their nation's honor aimed their explosive-laden dive bombers at enemy warships and went down with them. Ever since then, popular usage has referred to any self-immolating tactic or maneuver born of desperation as a kamikaze mission. However, to identify Shinto narrowly with war or with desperate acts such as those associated with kamikaze pilots is to miss out entirely on an overwhelmingly peaceful and beautiful tradition at whose core is the celebration of life and the sacred riches of creation.
What are the major festivities historically associated with CIT?
Each year on the day before the winter solstice, the emperor and his retinue visited the temple of heaven for an elaborate event. When paying homage to heaven and earth, the emperor would perform special gestures of humility by kneeling 3 times and prostrating himself 9 times. When he sacrificed to other powers, such as the sun, the moon, and the gods with power over the forces of nature, the emperor did not perform those rituals of self-abasement. At the Forbidden City's Hall of Supreme Harmony, major sacred events included the enthronement of a new emperor, royal weddings, an event held every 10 years called the Great Anniversary, Announcement of results of civil service examinations, and celebrations of the winter solstice and New Year. In the Hall of Middle Harmony, the emperor formulated decrees to be made public in royal temples at all the various seasonal festivities. Imperial officials designated by the emperor, or local administrators in the case of smaller events, took care of the regular agriculturally significant occasions throughout the country.
What does geography have to do with religion?
A separate subdiscipline of religious studies called the geography of religion investigates how and why religious communities start and spread as they do. Geographers of religion don't just provide us with detailed maps that illustrate spatially where the world's major religious groups are and what percentages of a regional population belong to what tradition. They also study how people attach religious meanings to the physical circumstances in which they live and move. Practically every religious tradition has its sacred geography. Cartographers devise a number of different kinds of maps: physical, political, meteorological. Sacred geography results in what might be called spiritual maps. These spiritual maps exist first of all in the minds of religious believers, and reflect the distinctive perspective of their traditions. But we can also plot on paper how various religious traditions map their world. Places that are especially sacred to a particular community of faith provide believers with a unique kind of orientation to the larger world. In many instances, a special place functions as a spiritual center of the universe, so that everything revolves around it. That is not a measure of the place's actual importance, of course. For many sacred places are relatively insignificant politically and economically, and quite hard to reach physically. Many traditions eventually develop networks of holy places. Their holiness can derive from their association with events in the life of some sacred person, from the belief that some special event occurred there, or simply from the perception that a natural feature such as a tree or mountain or spring possesses unusual spiritual power. What is most important to keep in mind is that physical settings matter a great deal, and that religious traditions claim pieces of this earth as sacred to themselves.
How and where do members of local Hindu communities come together?
Local and regional temples are the major gathering places. Hindus use religiously and socially and support financially. Individual temples in India are generally dedicated predominantly to a particular deity. Most center around some aspect or manifestation of Shiva or Vishnu, or one of their major female consorts or counterparts. A temple will typically also have subordinate shrines dedicated to other names and forms of the central deity. Some smaller local temples may also belong exclusively to Sex-worshipping deities largely unknown outside the area. Most temples draw sectarian client. In many regions outside India, however, greater diversity in the makeup of local communities often requires greater flexibility in the religious orientation of temples. For example, Indian immigrants around American cities such as Pittsburgh and St. Louis come from various places in India and represent a variety of sectarian backgrounds. As a result, the temples that serve the regions are sensitive to a wider spectrum of devotional needs than might be the case at a local temple in an area where Hindus are in the majority and where one sect predominates. Large temples in both Pittsburgh and St. Louis have been funded by Indian populations largely of immigrants from South India. Both temples are therefore dedicated to a popular South Indian manifestation of Vishnu called Sri Venkateshvara, Lord of the Sin-Forgiving Hill. But in order to serve the diverse local population, both temples include prominent devotional symbolism familiar both to Shaivites and to Vaishnavites.
How does Christian tradition interpret history? What is millennialism?
Christian tradition, like the Jewish and Islamic traditions, views history generally as a linear process with a beginning, middle, and end. Christian and Islamic views are different from the Jewish in that both later traditions regard the ages of their central figures, Jesus and Muhammad, as the high points of history. Christians believe Jesus the Christ entered the world at the fullness of time, establishing a new dispensation and initiating a sense of expectation of the eventual end of time. All that went before Jesus pointed to him and all that will happen since his life on earth moves inexorably toward a final resolution over which Jesus Christ will preside. Christian expectation of the end times is an ancient theme with roots in Jewish tradition and in the New Testament. Just as the identification of Jesus as the Christ fulfilled the hopes of some Jews for a Messiah, Jesus' own preaching seems to have fueled further anticipation of history's grand finale. Many early Christians apparently thought the end was imminent. For we find important writers backtracking and suggesting that no one can know when the day of the Lord will come. E.g. I Thessalonians 5:1-11. Eventually the idea emerged that Jesus would come again after a millennium, 1,000 years, and rule for another 1,000 before bringing time to an end.
What are the main sub-communities or denominations within Buddhism?
There are three major subdivisions of the Buddhist tradition. Theravada, wisdom of the elders. Buddhism predominates in Sri Lanka and throughout most of Southeast Asia, with the exception of Vietnam. Of the over half dozen, some say as many as 18, so-called Hinayana, Small vehicle. Schools that developed in India by the 2nd century BCE, the Theravada alone has survived in numbers into modern times. Mahayana, great vehicle, Buddhism in a large number of sub-denominations. And schools took hold particularly in northeastern Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. Vajrayana, thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism consists of several schools of esoteric thought and practice. They took hold particularly in the Himalayan region, in countries such as Tibet, Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan.
What does Shinto home worship entail?
Religiously committed Japanese families still maintain regular daily home rituals centered around the Kamidana. And perhaps also around the Butsudan or miniature Buddhist temple. Home shrines are dedicated and put into service when family members invite a priest over to install a talisman from the local shrine on which is written the name of the kami to be honored in the home. Worshippers perform a brief purification ritual and then do before the miniature shrine much the same thing they would do at an actual shrine. These rituals, often observed morning and evening, are generally very brief, lasting perhaps 3 to 5 minutes. Some families still ritually incorporate in the evening meal food offered to the kami.
May women attend Muslim burial services?
Women may attend funeral services at a mosque, though most mosques have separate sections for men and women. Sayings of the Prophet Muhammad recommend that women not attend burials because they might faint or lose control of their emotions. But the sayings stop short of barring women's attendance.
What is a priest?
A socio-religious class called priesthood has ancient roots in various traditions. Some priestly classes have perpetuated themselves through heredity. Some have been intimately associated with the performance of sacrificial ritual, whether bloody or not, and are typically connected with temple or church institutions both large and small. In some traditions, priests have been celibate as a group. But in most marriage is a prerequisite for all priests. Most of all, the priest functions as the chief ritual specialist and is often considered a mediator of spiritual power. An indispensable connection between the divine and the human. Even in societies where a hereditary priesthood is the norm, some type of specialized training is generally expected and provided. More often than not, priestly education aims to steep the trainee in the sacred text and its ritual uses, as well as in the ritual actions the priest can be expected to perform hundreds or even thousands of times a year. On the whole, it is safe to say that priests in most traditions are trained less as professional theologians than as public servants commissioned to facilitate the devotional life of the community. Special rituals called ordination in some traditions designed to dedicate individuals to the priesthood often bring the time of training to its culmination. Priesthoods are typically restricted to male membership, though there are some exceptions.
Do all traditions have savior figures or redeemers?
Virtually every tradition acknowledges that life is full of difficulties. But not all teach that someone else can rescue people from their problems. Theravada Buddhism, for example, emphasizes self-effort following the example of Buddha the teacher. Sunni Islam teaches that only surrender to God can bring a person's life to a good end. Some saviors, such as bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism, effect salvation for humanity purely by extending their power so that individuals are lifted out of their suffering. In those instances, the Savior remains largely above human misery. Some, such as Jesus Christ, work their saving deeds by redeeming or buying back a lost humanity. The notion of redemption presupposes that a savior figure spends him or herself as a kind of ransom. Identifying profoundly with the plight of humanity. This kind of redemptive suffering is relatively rare. Some traditions in which saints are prominent underscore the suffering of some holy persons. But they do not generally effect salvation through their pain.
What signs or symbols distinguish deist ritual specialists?
Deist priests or masters make extensive use of symbolic vestments in ritual settings. Apparently in imitation of the garments emperors once wore for religious rituals. Deist specialists today wear three types of vestments in various colors, depending on sectarian affiliation. For the most sacred occasions, a high priest wears a square red silk poncho-like vestment called the garment of descent that symbolizes earth. For regular major rituals, the celebrants might wear a red or yellow silk overgarment called the Deo gown with the character for Taiji or the 8 trigrams on front and back. Other common decorative motifs include images of the 8 immortals, often depicted on the hems of broad, flowing sleeves. Abstract cloud designs often stand for yin, while cranes and male versions of the mythical creature called the Qilin, sometimes associated with the unicorn, but very different from the European unicorn, represent yang. For penitential rites, the assistants might wear the sea blue vestment whose darker color accords with a darker ritual purpose. Under these garments, specialists wear a square silk apron. Officiants also wear distinctive headgear, including a black skull cap under a metal 5-pointed crown. Recalling the 5 elements, bestowed in the ordination ceremony. Ritual shoes like those once worn in the imperial court bear cloud symbolism that suggests the ability to walk the very heavens as the priest delivers the prayers of the people to the deities.
How did Islam spread under Muhammad's immediate successors?
Muhammad's immediate successors, called caliphs, pronounced Ka'ilif, inherited an expanding but loose-knit social fabric. The Prophet had united the Bedouin tribes under the banner of Islam. But tribal loyalties cooled quickly when the leader died. When Muslim elders in Medina chose Muhammad's father-in-law Abu Bakr as the first caliph, the initial challenge was to regather the tribes already reverting to their pre-Islamic ways. Umar, 634–44, the second caliph, then mobilized tribal forces to move northward into Syria and Mesopotamia, Iraq, westward into Egypt, and eastward into Persia. Next, Umar instituted important policies in the conquered lands, allowing the subjected peoples to retain their religion and law, and levied taxes often lower than what had paid previously to Byzantium and Persia. Muslim armies remained apart in garrisons that eventually became cities in their own right. Umar's successors, Uthman, 644–656, and Ali, 656–661, compassed the downfall of the last Sasanian emperor, but had to deal with disastrous internal strife as well.
When would the Messiah come? And how was one to identify him?
Largely on the basis of their reading of Scripture, the early followers of Jesus found the answers in Jesus. By a process that would come to be known as typological exegesis. Early Christians saw in numerous Old Testament personages anticipations or types of Christ. Abraham, for example, was a type of God the Father in his willingness to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, who was in turn a type of Christ. Jonah, who emerged alive after 3 days in the belly of the whale, was a type of Christ's resurrection after 3 days in the grave, a variation on the theme of typology saw in Jesus the perfection of realities only adumbrated in the Hebrew Scriptures. Aaron's priesthood, for example, was merely temporary, as evidenced by the destruction of the temple, but that of Christ was eternal, Hebrews 7. In addition to discerning these and other typological antecedents of Christ, interpreters saw in many prophetic writings veiled allusions to the Christ who was to come. In the so-called suffering servant texts of 2nd Isaiah, for example, early Christians detected such striking parallels to what they believed were the very essence of the life and death of Jesus that the prophet could only have been referring to this Messiah. In the Greek Testament, Jesus suggests a parallel between the works he now performs and Isaiah's references to a spirit-filled anointed one who preaches good news to the poor, frees the imprisoned, and heals the blind, and likens himself to Elijah and Elisha, Luke 4:16-30. These are only a few of the ways in which early Christians found legitimation for their views in Jewish tradition.
What place does purification occupy in Shinto ritual?
Few traditions place greater emphasis on the need to purify both participants in ceremonies and the place designated for the rites. Just as the primordial deity, Izanagi, purified himself upon exiting from the underworld, so must all worshippers before engaging in sacred rituals. The contrasting states of pollution or spiritual alienation, kagure, and ritual moral purity, hari, encompass a great deal of what Shinto tradition considers important. Purification with water is a prerequisite to even the simplest acts of worship. As an ordinary part of rituals performed by priests and shrine staff, purification requires waving a special wand over the individuals or their offerings, and sometimes involves sprinkling salt water or salt. Watch a sumo wrestling match and you will see the behemoth contestants liberally scattering fistfuls of salt across the ring as they enter to confront each other, a clue to the ancient religious associations of the sport. More elaborate purification involves ceremonial bathing to cleanse the individual of pollution and sin. Priests sometimes purify by immersion before major rites. Some adepts seek out sacred mountain waterfalls and stand beneath their frigid cataracts in winter as an especially potent form of purification. Most important is the ceremony called Great Purification, in which priests of the imperial household as well as throughout the country symbolically purify the whole nation, the whole world, according to some interpretations. Reciting special prayers, they mark the middle and end of the year with cleansing. Before a given shrine's major festivals, shrine priests put considerable time and effort into preparing themselves and the site. Officiants enter seclusion the day before the festival, bathe several times, and follow strict rules with respect to clothing, food, and abstinence from sexual activity.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Buddhists?
The Buddha emphasized that all religious and ethical teaching, dharma, is like a raft. You use a raft to get across a body of water. Once on the far shore, you would hardly choose to strap the raft to your back and trudge on under its bulky burden. Doctrine is a tool, a temporary convenience, and not an end in itself. The problem with doctrine, he taught, is that it can easily distract people from their goal. Those who ask too many questions in search of doctrinal clarity and certainty are like a person who has been shot with an arrow. Friends approach to remove the arrow, but the wounded person waves them off. Not until he knows who shot the arrow and what he looked like, of what kind of wood it was made, and what kind of bird provided the feathers, will he submit to having the arrow removed. Such speculation is simply a waste of time. Pay attention to the matter at hand, Buddha counseled. Not long after the teacher's death, followers of his Dharma nevertheless developed many elaborate doctrinal frameworks with which to interpret the Buddha's teaching. Each of the various denominations has its preferred scripture and its own theoretical perspective. And some have emphasized correct belief as a criterion of membership. But no major Buddhist school has defined a large body of doctrine in the form of dogmatic pronouncements that require the explicit assent of all members. Buddhists often use the Sanskrit term sasana in reference to the whole package of belief and practice that the Buddha taught as a way of life.
Are cults different from sects? Are they authentically religious groups?
We've become accustomed in recent years to hearing about various cults, both here and abroad, that claim religious inspiration and legitimacy. Think, for example, of the Branch Davidians of Waco, Texas, the Heaven's Gate group Suicide in California, or the Japanese Aum Shinrikyo, infamous for its nerve gas attacks on Tokyo's subway system. The term cult is sometimes used synonymously with new religious movement. And although there are varying opinions on the subject, it is possible to point out a few salient features. First, both cult and new religious movement are historically relative terms. A movement whose novelty and exotic qualities were so obvious to observers, say 1,000 years ago, might have turned out to be a major religious tradition by our time. Most recent new movements are not truly sectarian in the sense that they are not offshoots of larger religious communities. In addition, cults take the exclusivity that seems to characterize the sect as classically defined and separate themselves from society to a much greater degree than sects. Cults tend to be quite small, often having only one very localized community centered around a charismatic leader who exercises virtually absolute control over members. Cult leaders sometimes claim their authority on the basis of a direct new revelation, or special new insight and interpretation of mainstream sources such as the Bible. The leader's direct orders are often the only organizational structure. And when a cult leader dies, the cult often dies with him or her. Some cults seem to be oriented toward an end-time scenario and on occasion seem ready to do whatever they deem necessary to facilitate that end.
Is there such a thing as a non-religious Jew?
Some people who consider themselves Jews are not actively involved in the practice of the religious tradition. It is equally true that some people who call themselves Muslims or Buddhists do not engage in any religious practices. In both cases, one can speak of religious identification as a cultural phenomenon. People grow up in Buddhist or Muslim families and live where the vast majority so identify themselves as if by habit. But in the case of non-religious Jews, The racial or ethnic element is at least as important as the religious, and perhaps more so.